July 18, 1943. The waters off New Georgia, Solomon Islands. The morning sun burned copper through the haze as Lieutenant Commander James Sweat pushed his Grumman F-4F Wildcat into a dive that defied every page of the tactical manual sitting back at Henderson Field. 70 degrees, then 75. The altimeter unwound like a broken watch as the ocean rushed up to meet him, dark and indifferent. Below, the Japanese destroyer Amagiri cut through the swells, her anti-aircraft batteries tracking his descent with mechanical precision. Her gunners had trained for this. They knew the geometry of American dive attacks, the standard 45 to 50 degree approach that American naval aviators had perfected at Midway, at Coral Sea, in a dozen nameless skirmishes across the Pacific. They knew where to aim, how to lead the target, the exact moment when the diving aircraft would fill their gun sights. But Sweat was not diving at 45 degrees. He was falling like a stone thrown by God himself. And in that deviation from doctrine, in that mistaken angle that should have killed him, he found salvation. The Japanese guns fired. The tracers arced upward in beautiful, useless streams, passing behind his aircraft, above it, around it, everywhere except where he actually was. The story of the dive angle begins not in combat, but in the failures that preceded it. Throughout 1942, as American forces clawed their way from defeat to stalemate across the Pacific, dive bomber pilots faced a calculus written in blood and gravity. The Douglas SBD Dauntless, the workhorse of American naval aviation, had been designed around a doctrine inherited from peacetime exercises. Approach the target at medium altitude, roll into a dive at 45 to 50 degrees, release ordnance at 1,500 feet, and pull out with enough altitude to escape the blast and ground fire. The mathematics were sound. The physics were proven. In practice against Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine, it was gradually becoming a death sentence. Japanese naval gunners trained obsessively on intercepting dive bombers at standard attack angles. Their fire control directors, crude by later standards but effective within their parameters, calculated lead angles based on the expected trajectory of an aircraft, diving at regulation speed and regulation angle. By mid-1943, Japanese anti-aircraft batteries had achieved hit rates approaching 18% against American dive bombers, a figure that translated to nearly 1 in 5 aircraft damaged or destroyed on each attack run. The Americans possessed superior numbers, superior logistics, superior industrial capacity. What they lacked was unpredictability. The Japanese had learned to read American attacks like a familiar book, and they were writing their responses in hot steel. The pilots who flew off the carriers and island airstrips in those grinding months of 1943 expected war to reward precision and adherence to proven method. They had been drilled in the doctrine of the dive attack until it became muscle memory. The roll-in at a specific altitude, the dive angle maintained with religious devotion, the pull-out executed at a predetermined point, regardless of enemy fire. They expected that following these procedures would keep them alive, that the manual represented the accumulated wisdom of men who had survived to teach others. What they discovered instead was an enemy who had adapted faster than American doctrine could evolve. The Japanese had learned the American playbook and positioned every gun, every calculation, every trained reflex to exploit it. Flying by the book meant flying into a cone of fire so precise, it seemed as though the gunners could read their minds. The mistaken angle emerged not from innovation, but from desperation filtered through individual survival instinct. On that morning in July, Sweat found himself diving on the Amagiri with 2 problems compounding each other: His altimeter indicated he had begun his attack run 2,000 feet lower than optimal, and his engine was running rough, bleeding power that would make the pullout more sluggish, more vulnerable. The manual prescribed a solution: abort the attack, gain altitude, try again. But Sweat had watched 3 pilots abort runs that morning, and he had watched Japanese fighters pounce on 2 of them during their climb. The manual was written by men who would not have to explain to his mother why her son came home in a box. So he pushed the stick forward and committed to an angle that should have been suicidal. At 75 degrees, the Wildcat ceased to be an aircraft and became ballistic. Sweat could feel the wings groaning under stress they were never intended to bear for more than seconds. The Japanese guns below adjusted, compensating for the steeper angle, but their calculations assumed he would level out, that physics and human limitations would force him to ease back toward the standard approach. He did not level out. At 3,000 feet, where doctrine demanded he begin his pull-out sequence, he kept diving. At 2,000 feet, where every instinct screamed abort, he kept diving. The Japanese gunners, their training overriding their eyes, kept firing at where he should have been rather than where he was. The ocean filled his windscreen. At 800 feet, close enough to see individual sailors scrambling across the destroyer's deck, he released his bomb and pulled back on the stick with strength born of pure survival terror. The Wildcat shuddered, groaned, and clawed its way out of the dive. The bomb struck the Amagiri amidships, tearing through her deck plating and detonating in the engineering spaces below. But more significant than the hit itself was what Sweat realized as he leveled out. His hands shaking on the controls, his vision tunneled from the G-forces. He had not taken a single hit. Not one round of the hundreds fired at him had found his aircraft. The Japanese had been shooting at a ghost, at the phantom of American doctrine, rather than the reality of his dive. Word of Sweat's attack spread through the informal networks that connected American squadrons. The conversations in ready rooms, the debriefings that turned into tactical discussions, the letters between pilots serving on different carriers. Other aviators began experimenting, pushing their dives steeper, faster, closer to the ragged edge of controllability. The results were documented in after-action reports that filtered back to Pearl Harbor and eventually to Washington. Pilots employing dive angles between 65 and 80 degrees reported enemy hit rates that plummeted to as low as 4%. A mistaken angle, born of desperation and maintained through sheer nerve, had inadvertently created a tactical revolution. The dive angle became the new sacrament, passed from veteran to rookie with the fervor of religious conversion. Training protocols evolved, though never officially. The Navy was reluctant to codify tactics that pushed aircraft to their structural limits and pilots beyond the edge of standard procedure. But in practice, squadron commanders looked the other way when their pilots practiced near vertical dives, when they pushed into angles that made older officers wince. The mathematics were undeniable. Steeper dives meant fewer losses, and fewer losses meant more experienced pilots survived to train the next wave, creating a compound advantage that multiplied across months and years. The Japanese response revealed the limitations of their tactical flexibility. Their anti-aircraft doctrine, refined through years of training and combat experience, had calcified into dogma. Fire control directors could not easily be recalibrated. Gunners trained to track targets at specific angles struggled to adapt when those angles changed. More fundamentally, the Japanese military culture, with its emphasis on perfected technique, and adherence to prescribed method, lacked the mechanisms to rapidly disseminate and adopt tactical innovations from the field level. By the time Japanese anti-aircraft crews began adjusting to steeper American dive angles in late 1943, American pilots had already moved on to the next variation, approaching from unexpected vectors, varying their dive angles within the same attack run, introducing unpredictability as a weapon more potent than any bomb. In the intelligence reports filed by Japanese naval officers during the final year of the war, a recurring theme emerged: confusion at American tactical inconsistency, frustration at their refusal to attack in predictable patterns, grudging respect for their willingness to abandon proven doctrine when circumstances demanded adaptation. To the Japanese military mind, steeped in traditions of perfected kata and unwavering commitment to established method, the American approach seemed almost undisciplined. But discipline and adaptability are not opposites. They are different responses to the same existential question: how do we survive? The Japanese chose the discipline of perfection. The Americans chose the discipline of evolution. The mistaken dive angle, that deviation from protocol born in the desperate improvisation of a single pilot on a July morning, became emblematic of a deeper philosophical divide. In the rigidity of Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine lay the strength and weakness of a military culture that valued precision above adaptation, that sought security in the perfection of technique rather than the evolution of method. In the American willingness to abandon the manual, to push past what aircraft were designed to endure, to embrace angles that made engineers blanch and commanders nervous, lay the uncomfortable truth that survival often demands violation of the very rules meant to ensure it. By war's end, American dive bomber losses to anti-aircraft fire had been reduced by more than 60% compared to 1942 figures, not through better armor, not through superior aircraft, but through the accumulated impact of thousands of pilots who learned to fall from the sky at angles that rewrote the equations of interception. The manual that had once prescribed 45 degrees as optimal was quietly revised, though it retained the careful caveat that steeper dives should only be attempted by experienced pilots in combat conditions. The institution adapted, but slowly, always trailing behind the reality being written by men who could not afford to wait for official approval before trying to stay alive. The dive angle, that geometric relationship between aircraft and Earth, between doctrine and survival, became more than tactical innovation. It represented the difference between fighting the war you prepared for and fighting the war you face. The Japanese had prepared magnificently for one war, had drilled their gunners to mechanical perfection in tracking standard dive angles, had created a defensive system that would have been devastatingly effective against an enemy who fought by the manual. They encountered instead an enemy willing to throw the manual away when it stopped working, willing to risk everything on untested angles and unproven methods, willing to accept that the price of adaptation was chaos, uncertainty, and the loss of comfortable certainty. In the end, the mistaken angle was never really a mistake at all. It was desperation crystallized into doctrine, improvisation elevated to principle, the recognition that in war the greatest risk is often refusing to take risks. The Japanese guns, calibrated to perfection for targets that dove at familiar angles, fired into empty air while American bombs fell through the gaps in their calculations. Those silent spaces where gunfire should have been but wasn't became the signature of a military culture that prized adaptability over perfection. that understood the manual was only as good as its utility in keeping soldiers alive. The steep dive, the mistaken angle, the deviation from protocol, these were not failures of discipline, but expressions of a deeper discipline, the discipline of survival, the discipline of questioning, the discipline of learning from each morning's terror that the enemy has adapted, and therefore so must we. The ocean below remained indifferent, dark and vast, but the angles at which men fell toward it kept changing, kept evolving, kept defying the calculations of those who believed war could be reduced to geometry and fire tables. In that defiance, in that willingness to fall at impossible angles toward an unforgiving sea, lived the difference between fighting to maintain doctrine and fighting to win.